record until she was almost done anyway.
You did it?
Yeah, it's going now. Actually, would you mind sitting back there just in case the service is interrupted so you can restart it? I imagine we'll have a better connection here.
Hopefully, that's what I was hoping.
And I don't know if anybody comments there, because usually I'm sitting right next to it, to that speaker, so obviously they can hear me, but I don't know how well it's going to come through unless I hold this thing the whole time.
Hi.
Anyway.
Now I can give you pressure.
Oh.
Staring straight at you.
Hello, hello, hello. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to make any impact that far away. I can tell right here it's not making any difference unless I hold it next to my mouth, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, sun has gone down, so it's no longer Sukkot. Oh, man. Right? But it's Simchat Torah, so that's good. So I think what I want to do to start Simchat Torah today, after the candlelighting we did, thank you, Kathy, that was beautiful, is I want to mention something that maybe if you look on Facebook, you follow us on Facebook, you might have already noted, but along with Torah, a special event, there's a passage talks about Torah and mercy have kissed each other. And they've met, and they're not opposed to each other. Does that make sense? And I think that might have happened on this day, because there's an event on this day. Well, it was this day. It was the 8th day. It was this day when Yeshua was at the temple, and a little incident happened. Anybody read about it?
I believe it's when Yeshua was with the crowd, the self-righteous crowd, and the woman with adultery.
Yeah, this is the day when the mob brought that woman, who at least they say was caught in the act of adultery. And I think this was really a test for him, because what you're supposed to do is take people to a judge, to a court, where there are supposed to be witnesses corroborating and still, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like a normal legal process to determine guilt. But this was more like a mob just dragging her and throwing her in front of him and saying, "What do you say?" Now, how many know he wasn't the judge when he was walking on this earth? Do you know what I mean? He wasn't a legal judge. Does that make sense? Just like he wasn't on this earth a priest either. You see? There was a Levitical system. He was not from the tribe of Levi. He was also not a judge. This was a test to see if he was some sort of narcissist who's just trying, delusions of grandeur, and wants to be the man and would take over, usurp authority that doesn't really belong to him, and make a judgment and go along with the mob. If they could control him, if they had a little mob if he would be easily swayed to do whatever they want, if they could manipulate him via the mob. It didn't work out, did it, for them? No. In a way, it's like he claimed authority, but he didn't claim authority. He turned it back on them. He turned it all the way around and made them judges of themselves. Right? All right. Well, let's see where this can go. Okay, the one who has no sin, you cast the first stone. Today I don't know that would work, because a lot of people, not saying there are people who don't have sin in their life today by any means, but there are a lot of people who don't really care about the truth, and if they were in such a situation, they would just throw stones anyway. A lot of atheists who at least say openly that they have no belief in God at all, right? And they would just do whatever they want to do, and that's really sad. That's not to me, but at least there's some sort of integrity in these people to some degree that they acknowledged that none of them were perfect, and all of them did have some sin, and they were, and that made them walk away. But there's something else that happens at the end of the story. What happens at the end of the story? After they drop their stones and walk away, what happens?
He asks her what her condemners are, and then he tells her to, and she says no. So it says, then I won't condemn you either, and then he tells her to go and sin no more.
Yeah, so there's the longer mercy aspect. Where are your condemners? There's nobody here. Yeah, well, okay, I don't condemn you either. Now he's when he says I don't condemn you either, is he saying, I don't agree with Torah, adultery is fine. Is that what he's saying?
No.
No, that's not what he's saying. What might he be saying, according to what I was already telling you, is I'm not a judge, I'm not an earthly judge, I'm not sitting in a court, and there are no witnesses here,
Yeah.
even if I was. I'm not going to condemn you. But you know what? The second part, go and sin no more. Don't play with this opportunity. You know, that might speak to us, right? When we all have a sin in our lives, and we come to Yeshua, and He cleans us up with His commandments, and He gives us a legal status of justification because of what He did. Is that justification? Is that an opportunity? Should we look at that like an opportunity? That we can now live however we want, that we can go and sin the rest of our lives. It really doesn't matter because we said the magic words and He took care of it. Is that what it means? Mm-hmm. Not at all, right? We're supposed to go and sin no more too, right? Okay, so that was the story, and that's how we want to bring Yeshua into the 8th day. Now, I want to read Vayikra, Leviticus 23, verses 33 through 43. Okay. Adonai said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel, on the 15th day of the 7th month is the feast of Sukkot for 7 days to Adonai. On the first day, there's to be a holy convocation. That means you come together as a group and worship. Okay? It's an assembly for the purpose of worship. Do not do any kind of ordinary work. It's an annual Sabbath. You're not supposed to work. Okay? For 7 days, you're to bring an offering made by fire to Adonai. Temple doesn't stand, so we don't do that now, right? On the 8th day, wait a minute, it's a 7-day festival. What happened? On the 8th day, you're to have a holy convocation. So there's another holy convocation, the first day and then the 8th day. That would be the day that just finished. And bring an offering made by fire to Adonai again. It is a day of public assembly. Not meeting just with your family in the house, but a day of public assembly. So this would constitute like the congregation. Does that make sense? Out, and in public. Do not do any kind of ordinary work. So again, it's another annual Sabbath, the first day and the 8th day. And these are the designated times of Moses. Is that what it says? These are the designated times of the Jewish people. Is that what it says? What does it say there? Verse 37. These are the designated times of Adonai. They're not man-made feasts. They're not feasts of Moses. They're feasts of Adonai. They're His feasts. His appointed times. His moadim. His appointments with man. Special appointments where He promises to meet with us. And you know what? There are other aspects. There are prophetic aspects that I talked about a few weeks ago. Those could be the primary appointments with Adonai, right? There's Pesach every year, and then there's the Pesach when Yeshua dies. When all the other Pesachs, what they all pointed to. Does that make sense? There's Shavuot every year, but then there's the Shavuot. Or you might say two. Shavuots, right, with the mountain and the Torah. That's traditional understanding. And then there's one for sure when the Ruach HaKodesh falls in the upper room. So there's a prophetic aspect to all of them. But these are the appointments of Adonai. So what are the other appointments? And you can look back at our teaching, I think it was called the cycle or something like that, to find out what the other appointments are and what they're about. Moving on, you are to proclaim You don't keep it to yourself, right? You proclaim them. You share these things with other people. You let them know about it as holy convocations, and bring an offering made by fire to Adonai. A burnt offering, a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, each on its own day. And you can find out what those are in Numbers 29. Besides the Sabbaths or Shabbats of Adonai, your gifts, all your vows, and your voluntary offerings that you give to Adonai. In other words, well, we're already giving the morning and the evening sacrifice, so do we really need 14 sheep today, or do we need, 16 sheep today? If it falls under Rosh Chodesh, do we need more? Well, it can't, because the timing is not, it's later in the month. But you see, but what it's telling you is that's in addition to the other ones. You can't, you're not supposed to skip out on God, and So you got the 14 for most of the days, and the 8th day it skips down to how many sheep? Only 7. Every other day was 14. Every other day was 2 rams. Today was only 1 ram. The first day was 13 bulls, then 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. What's today? How many bulls? 1. Why? What is the 1 bull for? How many bulls total? Who can tell me? Over the whole period of 8 days? 70 bulls. Why? Why do we say there are 70 bulls?
1 for each nation.
1 for every nation, but there are more than 70 nations in the world. But Genesis chapter 10 gives what we call the table of nations, the table of families that spread out from the earth after the flood. And you know how many families are listed there? 70. Right. And so every year we were making sacrifices for every family, every nation group, every ethnicity, all around the world, and they didn't even know it. And 69 of them over the first 7 days, and then the 8th day, finally we take care of ourselves with the last bull. Okay? All right. And then 39, on the 15th day of the 7th month, we will gather the produce of the land. See, it's a harvest festival, the final harvest. You are to observe the festival of Adonai 7 days. The first day is to be a complete rest, and the 8th day to be a complete rest. When God says something, it's important. When he says it twice,
it's really important.
Double your emphasis. Even more important, right? On the first day, you're to take choice fruit. See, so it doesn't really have to be an etrog. The Orthodox say it's an etrog, but it doesn't really have to be. It just says choice fruit. On the 8th day, palm fronds, that's pretty specific, thick branches, and willow and river willows. And celebrate. It's a commandment to celebrate in the presence of Adonai your God for 7 days. Doesn't say you can't do it more than that, but celebrate for 7 days. In case you hate celebrating, you can stop early. You got to go at least 7 days, even if you hate. But if you like celebrating, you're good. Okay, everybody good? You are to observe it as a feast of Adonai 7 days in the year. It's a permanent regulation, generation after generation. Keep it in the 7th month. You are to live in Sukkot for 7 days. Every citizen of Israel is to live in a sukkah, so that generation after generation of you will know that I made the people of Israel live in Sukkot when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Adonai your God. Thus, Moshe announced to the people of Israel the designated times, the Moadim of Adonai.
How many days?
Oh, for living in the sukkah, right? How many days in the sukkah?
7.
Not 8, it's 7 in the sukkah, right? So you can put your tent up early if you don't like it. But you know what happens in 1 Kings when Solomon dedicates the temple? Did you guys read that? Anybody read that? 1 Kings chapter 8.
Mm-hmm.
Solomon's dedicating the temple, right? We finally built a temple. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. He didn't want to stop celebrating Sukkot. They did the 2nd week.
Oh, wow.
And the 8th day was really the 15th day when he sent the people home. Great celebration, yeah, party. The king didn't want to let them go. The king enjoyed the presence of the people. right? And that's kind of what the 8th day is all about every year, as a chance to stay in the presence of the King for just a little bit longer. That's what Havdalah is about. At the end of every Shabbat, we have the ceremony. I don't know if all of you've done Havdalah yet, where we let it linger a little bit more. We drag a little bit of Shabbat into the week with us, right? 20 minutes into Shabbat. We light Havdalah candles, and we smell the sweet spices and enjoy the fire. We talk about the distinctions that God makes between what's holy and what's secular, right? And we enjoy the distinction because that's what brings us peace. That's what gives us guidance. And to know, Judaism, some people look at it as some strict thing where, it's just a very tight, constricted life, and but it's guidelines from God to show you how to enjoy life, how to live right, to have a clean conscience before God. Other people, you don't really have that. You're just carrying guilt all the time. You're not even sure what's right and what's wrong, So we have Torah to teach us and to help us. All right. And I'm going to put that down because it has nothing to do with what I was going to talk about. So what? So what about Vayikra? So what about Bamidbar? So what that we have these commandments? Is the Torah reliable? Is it just part of some cultural phenomena? Is religion just culture? Right? Some people say religions, they just develop from culture. Why all the similarities of those religions that develop from culture? Some would say, there's something in the mind of man or something, there's similarities in the circumstance, and that makes them develop the same way in different patterns to some degree, right? And others would say, maybe there was a commonality way back. Maybe at some point we all recognized one God, but then things were confused as we spread around the earth, and we were divided from each other, and languages were divided, and the light just went out in the back. Does that mean I'm talking too long? Mm-hmm. I don't know. All right, moving on. But why do we rely on the Torah? Why do we rely on the scriptures? What tells us that these are reliable scriptures? How do we know that they're true?
Where do we start?
I'm going to tell you, it's true that we don't have original autographs. We do not have the original copy that Moses wrote. Did you know that? Did anybody not know that? We don't have the very paper that Moses wrote on. We don't have that anymore. Sorry if you didn't know. I'm sorry. Okay? Those are called the original autographs. That is, we don't have the original documents. But because papyrus is highly perishable material, they would have written it on papyrus. It just doesn't last, which can only survive for fairly long periods of time in extremely dry areas, like the Qumran caves, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. However, first I'm going to talk about accuracy, right? Accuracy. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest manuscript for the Tanakh was from 980 AD. It's almost 1,000 years after Yeshua was the oldest copy of the Tanakh that we had before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. But the Isaiah scroll was over 1,000 years older than that. Grasp that. Scholars in the universities were saying this stuff was made up. These things were just, we don't know who wrote them or when they wrote them. They're only from like 980 AD. And then one day a little shepherd boy chased his sheep into a cave. And what is this stuff? They found an Isaiah scroll. And then, you know what, the Dead Sea Scrolls they found, I'll get into that later. Almost the whole scripture. The only thing missing out there is the book of Esther. And multiple copies. 1,000 years older. Now we're back into the 2nd century BC. And you know what? They looked at that Isaiah scroll in particular and rolled it out. And they compared it to the Isaiah that we have today. 95% exactly identical. 95% exactly identical. The 5% variances, the 5% that are variances, the vast majority is like a spelling variation. Like instead of the O sound from a cholem male to just a cholem, same sound. You see? Do you understand what I'm talking about? Yeah. The vast majority. And obvious scribal errors. You know, like if you're making a vav, you know the vav is kind of a little hook at the top, and it comes down straight, right? It's very easy if you're on a computer to see the difference between the vav and the yod. But if you're a scribe and you're writing a yod, maybe sometimes the bottom part goes down a little far. Or maybe if you're making a vav, maybe your bottom of your vav doesn't go down all the way. Then eventually you might have a problem when you're making a copy from that copy. You see? But those things become easy to identify because, in some ways, because context tells you, like, what can this word possibly mean? It doesn't make sense with a vav there. This must be a yod, or vice versa. Do you see? That's what the 5%, the vast majority of the differences are. So you can feel very confident. Very confident. Why? Historicity, let's see. Names. In the Tanakh, there are 26 names of foreign kings, as well as the names of many of the Israeli and Judean kings in external sources. Okay? Now, if these things were an invention of, say, Ezra in the 3rd century BC, which some people claim, some scholars today, what did he go on some archaeological hunt to find these 26 foreign kings' names buried in the sands of Assyria and Babylon and Elam and all these different places in Egypt and whatever, from periods that were long before his time, so that you could get the names right? And get the right periods of where they were ruling, when they were ruling there and where they were ruling? It doesn't sound like a very scholarly conclusion to me. For thousands of years, the correct names were transmitted with minute accuracy. I'm going to tell you now the odds that this could happen by chance, or that by somebody, without going on some archaeological digs to find every one of them perfectly and line them up, the chances, 1 in, I don't even know how to say this, 1 in 7, 5, and put 22 zeros after that. I don't even know what, that's beyond trillions. And what's after trillions? I don't even, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sets of threes and zeros.
That's the 10th power thing.
It's just crazy. It's just crazy. It may safely be said, a scholar named Atkins has said, it may safely be said that no other work of antiquity has been so accurately transmitted. William Green said that. It is little short of miraculous, another scholar said, named Atkinson. Okay? Volume. Before the 19th century, we had, this becomes important. I'm sorry if it's dry, but it becomes important. Before the 19th century, we had 731 manuscripts of the Tanakh. 730 ancient copies of the Tanakh. In the 1890s, we found what's called Cairo Geniza. Okay, do you know what a Geniza is? When the Torah scroll gets old. See, now we look at older Torah scrolls and we think, how precious. This is awesome. We want to save them. We want to give them to the next generation. Like we want an old one. When we get one, we buy one, a big one day, and it's Holocaust survivor scroll, or one that's from really, really old and ancient times, right? Well, that wasn't the view of the Israeli people before. They want the new one. They want the new one where if there was any kind of this, the scribal error, it could be fixed. You want the new, clean one that's going to last a long time. What happened to the older scrolls? Because they're papyrus, they start to wear out. People maybe, we use the little metallic yod, right? So we don't get our oily fingers on it. But still, things happen and they deteriorate. When they deteriorate, they become no longer usable anymore. They used to store them in a closet. It's like a closet, like an additional ark or something looking closet, and stick them in there until the ark gets, until either A, they deteriorate on their own, or the thing gets so full that they have to empty it out, and then they would bury them. And a long time ago, they would burn them too, which is bad bananas now. But then they would do it or bury them. Okay, that's how they got rid of them. So that's why we don't have ones that are that much older. The only reason we have those ones from the Dead Sea Scrolls is because the people in Qumran were so reverent of the scriptures that they had. They knew the Romans were coming to wipe their community out, and they wanted to preserve what they had, so they hid them in those scrolls up in the caves where the Romans wouldn't find them. Thank you, wherever you are, people from Qumran now, for doing that. Isn't that a great blessing that we can look now and see how well preserved those scriptures are? All right. So in the Cairo Geniza, in the storeroom of an attic, in the synagogue in Cairo, Egypt, we found over 10,000 biblical manuscripts in Hebrew and Aramaic, hidden until they could be properly disposed of, and then they forgot about them. That's the only reason we had them. They forgot about them. As a matter of fact, when they were found, it was no longer a synagogue. It had been turned into a church, and they had gone up to the attic to see what's up there and clean it up. Hey, what's all this stuff? 10,000 more manuscripts. 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was 1947. Some from as early as the 3rd century BC. The newest ones were from the 1st century AD. Thousands of fragments representing every book of the Tanakh, with the exception of Esther, including that Isaiah scroll. 16 of them. Check this out. You know the Paleo Hebrew, the difference between Paleo, yeah? The more ancient, I think I showed you the Dalet, like the triangle for David, it's not Paleo Hebrew. The really ancient, like Moses' time Hebrew, right? When we found those Dead Sea Scrolls, 16 of those are in Paleo Hebrew. 12 of those 16 are Torah scrolls. 12 of those 16 are Torah scrolls. One is a copy of Yov, and some are extra biblical works out of the couple, 2, 3 that are left. Yov is the oldest book in the scriptures. You know that? It was written at the time of Abraham. Genesis is a collection of other writings that were edited together, okay, by Moses. He wasn't there. And in those, by the way, even in Genesis, we see some things that are astonishing. If you know the Hebrew in particular, you see Joseph making, like, it's a first-person account. Joseph in Egypt, you know what I mean? It's not something like a narrator saying, then Joseph said, it's Joseph speaking. Then I said to Pharaoh, you see what I'm saying? First-person accounts in there, which is pretty amazing. But the book itself it's an edited collection of this part, of this part, of this part. So that's why Job is the oldest. I mean, if I'm not making sense or have anything to add, that's wonderful. Why don't we have more, though? Why don't we have more of them? Like I said, there's a few things. Science, persecution, practice, ancient Hebrew perspective. I have to say Hebrew because it was more than Jewish people back that long ago. Science, I already noted, papyrus just doesn't last that long. So it had to be in like a perfect climate for it to last. Okay? Second, persecution. Enemies of Israel often burn Torah scrolls. The time of the Maccabees, they burned the Torah scrolls. Romans burned Torah scrolls. Are you with me? Practice. When the copyists were satisfied with the accuracy Or when copies were not satisfied with accuracy, or they were damaged or imperfect copies, they were condemned as unfit for use and placed in that geniza, or cupboard, to slowly deteriorate, right? Like I talked about already. Today, the standard practice is burial. Bad copies with errors were burned or buried. Obviously, it doesn't last if it's burned. It doesn't last very long if it's buried either. Perspective. The last one is perspective. Rather than seeing older copies as more valuable, the habit was to prefer the newer, more perfect, undamaged, unworn copy. Like I said. All right? Then, we also have, but we do still, amazing, even with that perspective, with all of that going against us, we still have all these thousands of fragments that have been, accidentally found. I don't think so, right? There are no accidents. And we also have the Septuagint, the versions of the Greek that were translated from the Torah. We have the Brit Chadashah quotes of the Tanakh. We have Talmudic quotes of the Tanakh. We have the Samaritan Pentateuch, right, which was modified a little for theological bias, but a copy of the Torah. Now, with all of these tens of thousands of manuscripts, we find with all of them, we find still 90% of the text exists across the board, 90% without any variance at all. At all. And the vast majority of discrepancies, again, are minute spelling variations and obvious scribal errors. Okay? From which the original Tanakh is 100% certain. You with me? Maybe you already felt this way, of course. That's probably why you're here. Who else comes on a Monday night unless you already believe the scriptures are real, right? But you might have friends who are struggling with that. Or you might be in a class where they're trying to make you struggle with that, right? Or something along those lines. Or you might have family members who struggle with that. So it's important to solidify your faith in this. That's astonishing, if not miraculous. Very little is in question regarding the original text. Very, very little. Interpretations of that text is a different story, though, right? How many different interpretations of the text do we have? And there's a lot of theological bias in some of those. And that's why it's important for you to, to either learn the original languages or find someone that does know the original languages so that they can give you a proper interpretation and help you with context, historical context, and cultural context, so you can understand the text better. Because you always have, anytime you're studying any text, you need to know who's speaking, who they're speaking to, what kind of things are going around, what idioms there were that were in use, and what those idioms mean, and all sorts of things, right? I dwell on that all the time, so I won't draw into too much of that. But those things are all very important. And theological biases get into people's heads so that interpreters, knowingly or unknowingly, a lot of times unknowingly, can have a bias in their interpretation. There are people who interpret the scripture. There are, do I want to go there? There are people, there's a feminists who are studying the Bible, and guess what God looks like when feminists translate the Bible? God looks like feminists. There are homosexuals who are translating the Bible. Yep. I don't even know if I want to say translating, that they're doing. They're twisting, really. But guess what God looks like in the new Bible that's coming out that's made by homosexuals? God looks like he's very pro-homosexual. Okay? Theological bias. It's not, but guess what? That one is, you can't find that really in the text. You have to twist the text. So it gets in there. It gets in there. When you have King James, there's we were talking earlier. I forget who was asking me about it. There's no James in the Bible. I'm sorry. In the Hebrew, Yaakov. Oh, it was in one of my Hebrew classes people were at. So there's the name Yaakov, right? That's the Hebrew. When you go to the Greek, did anybody know the Greek? Yaakov. Yaakov. That's the Greek. So how do you get from Yaakov to Yaakov? I can see. How do you get from Yaakov to James? Well, when the translators, like King James translators or or whatever, when they were looking at these texts, when they did the Tanakh section, what you might call the Old Testament still, Tanakh is what we say, which is more accurate. There, anytime they came across Yaakov or Yaakov in Hebrew, Jacob. You see Yaakov, Jacob, Yaakov, Jacob. When the same word appeared on the other side, and somehow it happened to match the person who funded their research. James. Go figure. Go figure. Okay. Now, prophecy is coming to pass. How do we know that these scriptures, we can rely on them? There's other ways, just because of the enormity of how many we have, how old they are, how well they were preserved, but there's also prophecies that were fulfilled. What prophecies do we want to talk about? Well, there were what comes to mind for you guys?
Like, I think of all the beasts spoken of in Daniel, how they represent different nations, and then those nations ended up coming into power just as they predicted.
Yeah, the 4 empires in the book of Daniel, in order and in their nature, right? Okay. What was the bear and the leopard and the long leg and all the stuff for Rome and the toes that are mixed metal and clay. Yeah, right? And that was, some of that had come to pass during his time, but not all of it, right? What else? Cyrus, by name, the person who would allow Israel to go back to their own land. By name. What about, speaking of Genesis, Abraham, God told Abraham that the people just coming from him would be in slavery in Egypt. He even told them exactly how long, 420 years. And later on in Exodus, we read that it's on the very day, the 420th anniversary, the very day, exactly 420 years after going into slavery, that they left Egypt. Those are not accidents. What about the Brit? The best scholarship now, when I say Brit, Hadashah, you know what I'm talking about? Everyone knows what I'm talking about? Okay? The best scholarship now says that the Gospels were written in the 40s and 50s of the 1st century. I'm talking about the best scholarship, because others don't agree, but the best scholarship. Sociological and anthropological, thank you, studies of oral transmission demonstrated amazing precision in Oriental communities like that of Israel. Amazing. The church showed anti-Jewish sentiments in the following centuries after the 1st century, but these texts don't reflect anti-Jewish sentiments. What should that tell us? It wasn't written by them. It was written before that. Before that seeped in. Do you see? Well, they wouldn't write that stuff. They wouldn't write it this way. Conclusion, these are not myths developed over long periods. These were written very close to the actual events. Bibliographic test. You know what I'm talking about? There are different tests to see if ancient texts are reliable. So, I see some people really bored. I'm crazy because I love this kind of stuff. So I'm sorry. I'll come back to other stuff.
I got woken up this morning.
But anyway, okay. So there are different tests for ancient texts to see how accurate they are. One of them is called the bibliographic test. And that is, it says how many copies do we have, and how close are they to the original? Like how soon after the original were they made, right? So we're comparing now Herodotus and Thucydides. Do you guys know them? Have you studied ancient Greek history? Okay, you got one anyway. So you know Herodotus ethnicities. They were like the old-time historians. One is
we
like
heard about
the
it
first
before,
historian we
today,
know of.
That video we watched.
Okay, and so we have 8 copies. 8 copies of each. Herodotus is from the 5th century BC. The earliest copies we have of Herodotus, I don't know if you know this, are from 900 AD or CE. 900. That would be 1,300 years after the original. So, comparatively speaking, we're in good shape. Levy or and Tacitus. Have you studied Roman history too? Levy, Tacitus, okay, Roman historians from the 1st century. These guys were Roman historians from the 1st century. We have 20 copies of Levy, and we have 1 of Tacitus. And the earliest copies of Levy are from 8 and 900 AD. The oldest one of Tacitus are from 1000 AD. 800 years after the originals. And how do scholars feel about those copies we have, do you suppose? They are all considered highly reliable. Those are considered highly reliable. Are you kidding? We have 8 copies from the 800 years after. That's not so bad, right? Very highly reliable. Those same scholars will look at the scriptures. How many copies did I say we had? Thousands. Thousands. And how close to the original? As far as Brit Hadashah, very, very close. As far as the Tanakh, much closer than that. And then they attack it. The Gospels. Papyrus fragments from as early as the 60s. We actually have copies from as early as the 60s, as little as 15 years after the events. Now, scholarship, like I said, scholarship shows there are ones that are, we can tell when it was written. It was old. They're older than that. But even the oldest one we actually have a copy of is from the 60s. Over 100 papyrus copies from the 2nd to the 4th century. Over 100, not 8, not 1.
What about Josephus?
I didn't look up Josephus to see how many. 5,000 copies from the 5th century and on. So bibliographic test, how do you think we did? I think we pass. I think the scriptures pass, it's safe to say. Internal test, any reliable qualified claims as eyewitnesses to the events. There are multiple claims of eyewitnesses who agree and are qualified. People like businessmen, tax collectors, and honest people. Remember, they agree, but they're not identical. That's important. Why is that important? If you go into a court hearing, right? If you go into a court hearing, you're sitting on the jury, and Zach comes up and he's giving a testimony, a witness to something that he saw happen, right? And you're a diligent jurist, so you're listening very closely, right? Then he's just chewing your gum. Sure, okay. And then Zach is done, he sits down, and Stephen comes up and he gives his account. And his account is exact, word for word, what Zach said. His account is word for word. It's not just, he's saying the same thing happened, but he's using the exact words all the way through. What are you thinking when you hear that? And then Stephen sits down and Lynn comes up and her story is exactly the same word for word. What are you thinking? What would you be thinking? If it's word for word, what you're thinking, it's a popular word these days, you're thinking collaboration. That's what you're thinking. They all got together and got their stories straight, and they're saying exactly what they wrote down on a piece of paper. Do you see what I'm saying? But when you look at the Gospels, you see the same thing, but you don't see exact match. Do you understand? You don't see something that can't be reconciled either. You see, this Zach remembered, as if they were Zach and Stephen and Elora, whatever, right? Zach remembers some things that Stephen didn't remember. Stephen remembers something that you didn't remember. Laura and Lynn, they remember something, they both remember something that neither of you remember. But the vast majority, you remember things, but you tell them a little bit differently. That's proof. That's proof that gets through a court of law. Do you understand? Of truth. Incidental, what else? Incidental, unflattering, embarrassing details are in there. If you're going to make up a story, about a Messiah, are you going to tell them, how you said goofy stuff? You know what I mean? Like Peter always did, Kifa. You know what I mean? Like they see the Spirit walking on the water, and you say something, is that really you? and then you're gonna get out on the water because he says, yeah. What if it's not really him and you get out on the water? Because you know what I mean? What if you're sitting on the top of the mountain and you're like, should we build shelters for you or something? Just because you want to have something to say. What about the guy? What is his name? There's a guy when they're taking Yeshua and they're arresting him and they're taking away for trial. What happens? Does anybody know what happens there? There's something when they're dragging away, and most of the people have run away. There's one guy who's there, and something happens to him. It's really embarrassing. But there's something really, really embarrassing. There's one guy there who they grab, and he's terrified. So he runs. He manages to get away from them, and when he gets away from them, they still have his clothes. He runs away naked. You remember this? You remember this? It's Luke, I think. No, Mark. It's Mark. Mark escapes naked. Would you put that in there? I wouldn't put that in there. Why do people need to know that? But you know what I mean? Incidental details. Matthew. We know everybody else was Mattisyahu, right? Matthew. And what do we know about him? He was a tax collector, right? What was his real name? What was his other name? Other people called him Levi, right? And when they give the account of him, when Yeshua meets him, they use a different name. Why? To protect him. Because why? Everybody hated tax collectors. So they're trying to protect him and not use his name, right? All the other Gospels are trying to protect him and use a different name. But when he writes about his own encounter, he uses his own name. They were trying to protect him. Do you see? Incidental details. Okay, external test. Historical records or writings. Archaeology. There are books written about all the archaeology that the pavement. When Yeshua is on trial. Right? Where is he? Do you remember? I just said it a second ago. Where is he? The pavement. We call it the pavement. Our translations say the pavement. Gabata, it's called. Well, there's this little area where Herod would hold trials. It was kind of outside. It was outside one particular gate. It's a very small area. You can only fit about 100 people in there, right? Now, people who are anti-Semitic say things like, you see, the Jewish people called the curse on themselves. You know, the one part of the trial, let his blood be on us and on our children, right? And people who are anti-Semitic say, hey, see, they're all cursed. That's why all the bad stuff happens to them. They did it themselves. As if to say all of the people in Israel, the millions of people, somehow squeezed into the little area that holds 100 people. There were tens of thousands of people even in Jerusalem there. This is a special crowd that the people who were framing Yeshua got together to bring in there. Do you see a difference? There's a very big difference, right? And it's the leaders who are conspiring. They're the ones arranging this whole thing. Not everybody. Well, this pavement, though, there's a problem. Scholars were saying, where is this pavement? We don't see any pavement. This is ridiculous, this area that they're talking about. It doesn't even exist. They made this up. Guess what we found through archaeology? Just recently, they found the pavement. There's a place, Pool of Bethesda, that's mentioned. Was destroyed during the siege of Jerusalem. But guess what? Just recently discovered the Pool of Bethesda. Titles for rulers, they kept changing all the time depending on what kind of colony it was in the Brit Hadashah. A lot going on out there. Titles kept changing, depending what kind of colony. And so it would be really tough to come up with. If you're writing this like 100 years later or something, you would have to do a lot of research to figure out who was in charge of what, when, and what the right title was, and yada, yada, yada. Well, William Ramsay, Sir William Ramsay, looked at that, and he said, Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed with the very greatest of historians because of his work with these titles. Culture seen in the text perfectly matches that of first century Judea and Judaism, per the text found at Qumran and the Gnostic library at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. See, they can look and you can look at texts, even if they're not biblical, you can understand some things about the culture that they're written in and how language changes over time. You can see when those things were written. Do you understand? And when they put all that together, they can identify cultural elements. They can see now that the culture in the Gospels perfectly matches first century Judea and Judaism. Perfectly. References by Josephus to Yeshua and his followers, his miracles, his teachings, his death and resurrection. Look in Antiquities 18.3.3. Antiquities 18.3.3, and you can read about Yeshua. Thales wrote about the earthquake when Yeshua died. Remember the big earthquake when he died? Yeah. Another historian wrote about that. This was just a taste. If you want more, look at this. For textual criticism, look at a book, The Distortion, by Dr. John and Dr. Patrice Fisher. And they'll talk about it for the brief. For Old Testament textual criticism, that's the name of one book, Old Testament Textual Criticism by Ellis Brocksmith. It's a great work in regards to the Tanakh. More Than a Carpenter, very easy read by Josh McDowell. Very strong in logic, too. You can't get around that the scripture is true and reliable. It isn't that long ago. It isn't that long ago that so-called scholars insisted that Moses, I don't know if you know this, that Moses could not read or write. I think it was in my own lifetime, actually. They were claiming that Moses could not read or write, because humans had no such skills in those days. Now we know, not only could he have known and read and wrote his own native language, but he would have had to master Egyptian hieroglyphics in the court of Pharaoh, and he most likely knew other languages like Akkadian as well. Bottom line, don't be overly impressed by so-called scholars. They rely on speculation in order to bolster their own world views, and they do it far more than people realize. Far more. There is a massive abundance of evidence on the reliability of the Tanakh. And, matter of fact, that's another work. It's about this thick. It's a great work called On the Reliability of the Old Testament. It's by a scholar named Kitchen. I think you'll enjoy that one. Science and Logic, ICR.org. Institute of Creation Research, ICR.org. The Case for the Creator by Lee Strobel. And New Evidence, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. Okay? So there's tons out there. I mean, I don't know, I already believe, this isn't doing much for me. I get it. But somebody needs this. People need this. We need to know that we can rely on this word, and other people who don't believe yet need to know. Am I right? Okay. So there are some sources for you, and I hope you got something out of this. Father, thank you for your holy word, for your guidance, for your love, for your protection, for your provision, for your mercy, and for your salvation. And to finish, moving on, most congregations will have a re-rolling of the scroll on Simchat Torah. Now, we're not going to have a re-rolling of the scroll because we don't do the annual reading. We have the 3-year reading. So we're not done with the scroll. Wouldn't make sense for us to re-roll it, right? But, and why did they do that? Prior to 586 BC and on through the 1st century AD, the reading cycle in the Torah in Israel consisted of 154 sedarim, or orders. The Haftarah, if you're interested, Haftarah portions were not created until 165 BC, and so they would have had those in the 1st century AD as well, but it was much later that they were created. The big change, why they do every year, during the Babylonian captivity between 586 and 537 BC, the Torah was divided into 54 parshot, and an annual reading cycle was formed. Some of them you do a double, like 2 in certain weeks. If you've been through that cycle a few times, you should know that. However, it wasn't used in Israel until during the 1st century AD. It wasn't used in Israel for quite a while afterwards still. 2nd, 3rd century, I can't remember which. We don't have anything against that annual cycle. It's a good cycle. It's just not what we're using now, and it's not what Yeshua used. We're using the system Yeshua used here on earth when he sukkahd among us. So that's why we're not re-rolling our scroll. Nevertheless, tradition is rejoicing with the Torah. And so to do that, we do a parade, and we dance around with the Torah, and we carry the scroll. And if you never carried the Torah scroll before, it's a great honor, you know. And so if you want to do that, this is your chance today to walk around, dance around, whatever, with the Torah. Just be careful, don't trip and fall down with the Torah. So let me ask you a question. Do you love the Torah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, you guys are really... Yes. Do you love the Torah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah? You sure?
Yes.
You're not just saying it to make me happy. Okay. Do you love the Word of God?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Then let's see some joy. I'm done talking. This should make you happy. Some joy. All right. Good deal. So we're going to finish with the Horah medley. And when we do the Horah medley, and if we can repeat it if we need to, until everybody gets a chance to parade with the Torah. We're going to do it. Zach's going to lead the first time. We're going to go with like a figure 8 kind of thing in here. This is not a room we're usually in. So he's going to kind of, if you feel like you need to break that, because we're not entirely completely traditional here. If you want to go some others, that's fine too. Have fun. Rejoice with the Torah. Okay? And that's what we're going to do now, but I have to finish the recording first. We'll do the benediction as soon as we're done reading, as soon as we're done with the parade. So we're going to have to say goodbye to the internet audience now. Appreciate you watching. I hope somebody's watching. I can't see it today, so I don't know. All right. And thanks for joining us, and enjoy Simchat Torah. If you want to look at there's some traditional readings, you can look at our website and find what those are for Simchat Torah and read them tonight or tomorrow. Some people stay up all night long studying the Torah. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to read it tomorrow. Anyway, maybe it's because I'm old and non-traditional. I'm traditional to a point. Okay. All right, so goodbye, audience. Have the internet. Shalom. Good? Okay, great. Let's do the...
Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah.
Yeah.